The alarm in the training dome screamed before I even understood what was happening. Red light washed over every wall. Somewhere above us, a support cable had snapped, and a 2-ton practice drone was falling straight toward a row of seated students who had nowhere to run. I froze. Everyone froze. Except her. Grace Sutton did not scream. She did not even stand up fast. She rose like she had all the time in the world, grabbed the collar of the boy next to her, and pulled him sideways with one arm, while the drone crashed into the exact spot where he had been sitting a heartbeat earlier. Dust and sparks filled the air. The whole dome went silent, except for the ringing in my ears. She looked at the twisted metal, looked at the boy she had just saved, and said, calm as anything, "You should sit at the end of the row next time. Better sight lines." Then she sat back down like nothing had happened. That was the first time I really saw Grace Sutton. Not the transfer student rumor everyone whispered about in the hallways. Not the name teachers mispronounced during roll call. The actual person. And I remember thinking, right there, in that dust-filled dome with my heart still hammering, that something about her did not fit the story the rest of us had been told about her kind. My name is Oliver Bennett, and I go to the Cassandra Academy, a school built to train the best young minds from 100 different worlds. We come from oceans of gas giants, from cities built inside mountains, from moons with 3 suns and no night. And once in a while, a human comes too. Not often. Humans are rare here, mostly because most people do not think Earth produces anything worth training. Earth has a name among the older species. They call it a Deathworld. It is not a compliment. It is not really an insult either. It is just a fact, stated the way you might mention a planet has too much gravity or not enough oxygen. A Deathworld is a place where the environment itself seems built to kill you. Predators bigger than shuttles. Weather that flips from ice to fire in the same week. Diseases that mutate faster than most species can even name them. Most planets in the Alliance are gentle by comparison. Controlled climates, manageable wildlife, comfortable enough that most species forgot what it felt like to genuinely fear their own home. Humans did not get that comfort, and somehow, according to Grace, that difference never made humans weaker. It just changed what kind of strength they built instead. I did not know any of this on the first day she arrived. All I knew was that the seat next to me in advanced systems theory had been empty for 2 weeks, and then one morning, it was not. She walked in wearing the plain gray uniform everyone wore, hair tied back, carrying nothing but a data slate and a small metal cup of something that smelled like strong tea. She did not look around the room the way new students usually do, searching for friendly faces or empty seats. She scanned it once, quickly, the way you might check a room for exits, and then sat down next to me without a word. "Hi," I said, because someone had to say something. "I'm Oliver." She looked at me for a moment, like she was deciding whether I counted as a threat or not, and then something in her face relaxed, just slightly. "Grace," she said. "Sorry, habit. I always check the room first." "Check it for what?" "Exits. Where the noise would come from. Where I'd go if something happened." She said it so plainly, the way someone else might describe checking their schedule. Then she must have noticed my expression, because she added, "It's not a big deal. Everyone where I'm from does it. You stop noticing you're doing it." I did not understand yet how true that sentence was. I would understand it a lot better later. Word about her spread fast, the way it always does in a school, with students from 100 different worlds crammed into one set of hallways. By lunch, half the cafeteria already knew 3 things about her. She was human. She was from actual Earth, not one of the safer human colonies built on gentler planets, and she never once flinched at anything that made everyone else flinch. There was a boy from a species with natural echolocation who liked to test new students by clapping his hands sharply behind their heads without warning, just to see them jump. He tried it on Grace during lunch. She did not jump. She turned around, looked at him with mild curiosity, and asked if he was trying to check the acoustics of the room. He walked away, looking more confused than embarrassed. There was a professor, a broad-shouldered being with plated skin and small tusks, who taught a mandatory safety class about extreme environments. He liked to show recordings of dangerous alien worlds to scare the younger students into taking the subject seriously. He showed one of a human colony world during a storm season, wind strong enough to lift vehicles, lightning strikes every few seconds across a horizon that looked like the end of the world. Half the class gasped. Grace watched it with the same expression she might use to check a weather forecast, and afterward she raised her hand and asked if he had footage from an actual storm season back on Earth itself, because that clip looked mild by comparison. The professor did not have an answer for that. He just moved on to the next slide. I started noticing small things about her over that first week. She ate quickly and efficiently, never distracted while she did it, like eating was a task to be finished rather than something to enjoy slowly. She never sat with her back to a door, in any room, ever. If someone came up behind her too quickly, her whole body would shift half an inch before she even seemed to consciously register the movement, and then she would relax again once she recognized who it was. She slept less than anyone else in our dormitory wing, and when I asked her about it once, she said something that stuck with me. Where I grew up, you didn't get to sleep through every night. You learned to rest light. It's not that I don't trust it here. My body just hasn't caught up yet. I wanted to ask what that meant exactly, what growing up on Earth actually looked like, what kind of world raised someone who treated falling drones and lightning storms like minor inconveniences. But something about the way she said it, quiet and matter-of-fact, made me feel like it was not a story she wanted to tell yet, so I let it go, for the time being. Instead, I tried to be her friend the normal way. I showed her around the parts of campus she had not found yet, the quiet study garden behind the east wing, the good coffee stall near the transport bay that nobody else seemed to know about, the shortcut through the lower corridors that saved 10 minutes getting to afternoon classes. She was polite about all of it, genuinely interested even, but I noticed she always walked a half step behind me in new places, watching corners before we turned them, watching my back the way you would watch over someone smaller and more fragile than yourself. At first I thought it was strange. Later I realized it was just instinct. She was not doing it because she thought I could not handle myself. She was doing it because on her world, watching the people around you was simply what kept everyone alive. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after she arrived, I finally got a small piece of the real story. We were sitting in the study garden, and a group of younger students nearby were arguing loudly about whether Earth was actually as dangerous as people said, or whether it was just an exaggerated rumor that had grown bigger every time it got repeated across the Alliance. "It's true," Grace said quietly, without looking up from her data slate. "Mostly." The younger students turned toward her, surprised she had spoken at all. "Every part of it?" one of them asked, half laughing, like he expected her to admit it was all storytelling. "The predators are real, the weather is real, the diseases used to be a lot worse before we figured most of them out." She set the slate down and looked at the group calmly. "Humans didn't survive Earth by being the strongest thing on it. We weren't, not even close. We survived by refusing to stop, generation after generation, until refusing to stop just became part of who we are." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the younger students asked, half joking and half genuinely curious, whether that meant humans were secretly the toughest species in the Alliance. Grace almost smiled at that. Almost. "No," she said, "it means we're just really, really hard to convince that something is over." I thought about that sentence a lot in the days that followed. I did not know yet how soon I would see exactly what she meant by it, in a room full of people who thought fear was the only reasonable response to a real threat, and one girl who had simply never learned to see it that way. Because Trouble at Cassandra Academy did not stay quiet for long, and Trouble had already noticed her. His name was Threk Vantor, and by the time Grace arrived, everyone in our year already knew to stay out of his way. He came from a species built for raw physical dominance, plated across the shoulders, claws that never fully retracted, a temper that ran short even on his best days. His family held enough influence with the school board that teachers tended to look the other way when he pushed things too far, which meant he had spent years learning that there were very few consequences waiting for him no matter what he did. He had never met anyone quite like Grace before. None of us had, and it would not take him long to decide that her calm, quiet confidence was something he needed to break. I did not know it yet, sitting in that garden with the afternoon sun warm on my shoulders, but the quiet weeks were already ending. Somewhere down the hallway, in a classroom none of us had any reason to think about yet, the first real test of exactly what a Deathworld girl was made of had already begun taking shape. Threk Vantor had a way of testing people before he decided how much space he was allowed to take up around them. He would start small. A shoulder bump in a crowded hallway that was just hard enough to matter. A comment dropped just loud enough for the target to hear, but quiet enough that a teacher walking past would not think much of it. He watched how people reacted to those small things, and he built his behavior from there. If someone flinched, he pushed further. If someone looked away, he pushed further. Fear, to him, was an invitation. Grace did not give him an invitation. She simply did not react the way he expected, and that confused him more than any pushback ever could have. The first real encounter happened in the transport corridor between the science wing and the main hall, a narrow stretch of hallway that got crowded every day right after third period. I was walking a few steps behind Grace when Threk came around the corner, with two of his usual companions trailing him, laughing at something none of us could hear. He saw Grace first. I watched his eyes move over her the way they moved over anyone new, sizing her up, deciding what kind of reaction he could get out of her. He stepped directly into her path, close enough that most students would have stepped back automatically just to keep the distance comfortable. Grace did not step back. She stopped, looked up at him with an expression that was not fear and was not defiance either. It was simply attention, the kind you give something you are trying to understand. "You're the human," he said, tilting his head down at her, using his height the way he always did, like it was a tool rather than just a fact about his body. "The one everyone's talking about. From the Deathworld. That's the planet, yes," she said. "I'm just a person who happens to be from it." A few students nearby had already stopped to watch, the way people do when they sense something might happen. Threk noticed the audience and seemed to enjoy it. "I heard humans are supposed to be tough," he said, loud enough now for the small crowd to hear clearly. "Funny, you don't look like much." "Most things don't, until you actually need them to be something," Grace said. Her voice never changed pitch. There was no challenge in it, no mockery either. It was just a statement, offered the way you might correct a small factual error. Threk's companions laughed at that, not entirely sure whether it was an insult or not, which seemed to annoy him more than if Grace had simply gotten upset. He leaned in closer, close enough that I felt my own pulse pick up just watching it happen. "Careful," he said. "I don't think Deathworld reputations mean much once you're actually standing in front of something that could hurt you." Grace looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not into anger, but into something quieter and much harder to read. "You'd be surprised what things look like something dangerous and turn out to be manageable," she said. "And you'd be surprised what looks harmless and turns out to be the thing you really should have worried about." She stepped around him then, unhurried, and continued down the hallway like the conversation had simply ended on its own. Threk stood there for a moment, jaw tight, clearly unsure whether he had won that exchange or lost it. His companions exchanged a look, and then followed him without saying anything else. I caught up to Grace a few steps later, my heart still going faster than it should have been for a conversation that technically involved no shouting at all. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm fine," she said, and she genuinely seemed to be. "He's not dangerous, he's loud, those are different things." "He's dangerous to most people here," I said. "Nobody messes with him. Teachers don't even stop him half the time." Grace considered that for a moment. "That's a problem with the teachers, not a fact about him," she said. "Someone's let him believe that being big and being right are the same thing. Eventually, something is going to teach him otherwise. I'd rather it not be me, honestly. I'm not looking for trouble. I believed her completely. She really was not looking for trouble, but trouble, in the shape of Threk Vantor, had already decided it was looking for her. Over the following days, the small incidents kept happening, spaced out just enough that no single one seemed serious enough to report. He would appear in the same hallway as her at strange times that could not have been coincidence. He would make comments about Earth in front of other students, exaggerated stories about humans being weak, mockery dressed up as jokes, testing to see which version of the insult finally landed. None of it worked the way he wanted it to. Grace either ignored it entirely or responded with the same calm, factual tone she used for everything, which seemed to frustrate him far more than either anger or fear would have. I started noticing that the other students around us were watching this unfold with real interest. Word about the exchanges spread the way rumors do in a school with too many bored teenagers and not enough excitement. People began arriving early to shared classes just to see if Threk would try something new, and whether Grace would finally react the way everyone expected a normal person to react to him. She never did. And that, more than anything else, seemed to be exactly what pushed him further. The turning point, the one that really mattered, happened almost 2 weeks after that first hallway encounter, in a shared laboratory session where students worked in pairs on a coding assignment involving navigation systems for atmospheric shuttles. Threk had been paired, through pure bad luck, with a quiet boy named Marcus Vane, someone who barely spoke above a whisper even under normal circumstances. Threk had been coasting through the class for weeks, letting quieter partners do the actual work while he took credit for it. And nobody had challenged that arrangement because nobody wanted the trouble that came with challenging him. Grace was seated at the station next to them, working with a girl named Lily Grant, and she happened to glance over at Marcus's screen at the exact moment Threk was explaining a section of code to the instructor that Marcus had clearly written entirely on his own. She did not say anything immediately. She waited until the instructor moved on to check other stations, and then she leaned over quietly and said something to Marcus that I could not hear from where I sat. Whatever it was, Marcus sat up a little straighter afterward, and for the first time in weeks, he raised his own hand to ask the instructor a technical question directly, one that made it obvious he understood the material completely on his own. Threk noticed. Of course he noticed. His whole system depended on nobody drawing attention to what he was doing, and Marcus suddenly speaking up on his own unraveled weeks of careful arrangement in a single afternoon. After class, he cornered Grace in the hallway outside the lab, this time without an audience, which somehow made it feel worse rather than better. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice lower now, sharper, telling him to talk, making me look like an idiot in front of the instructor. I told him to answer honestly when asked a direct question, Grace said. "That's not the same as making you look like anything. You did that part yourself, over several weeks, by letting him do your work." "Watch your mouth," Threk said, stepping closer, his claws flexing slightly at his sides, an old habit that usually made people back away immediately. Grace did not back away. She simply looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at his face, with an expression that was somehow more unsettling than fear would have been. "You keep doing that," she said, "flexing your hands like that's supposed to mean something to me. I understand it's meant as a warning where you're from. I'm just telling you, calmly, that it isn't landing the way you think it is." For a moment, Threk looked genuinely thrown, like he had expected a very specific reaction, and simply was not getting it, no matter how hard he pushed. Something in his expression shifted from anger into something closer to humiliation, the kind that comes from realizing, in front of witnesses even if they were not physically present anymore, that the tool you have relied on for years might not actually work on everyone. "You'll regret that," he said finally, his voice tight, before turning and walking away down the corridor. Grace watched him go, her expression unreadable, and then turned back to me, since I had been standing a few steps away the entire time, close enough to hear everything. "That went badly," I said. "It went honestly," she said. "Those aren't always the same thing, but sometimes they overlap." She paused, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like tiredness. Not physical exhaustion, but something older, something that had been carried a long way. "People like him always think the loudest reaction in the room is the strongest one," she said quietly. "Where I'm from, the loudest reaction usually gets you killed first. Real strength tends to be a lot quieter than people expect." I did not fully understand what she meant by that, not yet. I would understand it completely, very soon, in a room none of us would forget for a long time afterward, because Threk Vantor did not let go of things easily, and humiliation, to someone like him, was not something you simply absorbed and moved past. It was something you needed to answer, publicly, in front of the very same people who had witnessed it happen, and he was already deciding exactly how he intended to do that. None of us knew yet how far he was willing to take it. We were about to find out, in the very last place any of us expected something like that to happen. The morning it happened started like every other morning that semester, which is probably why none of us saw it coming until it was already too late to stop. We had Advanced Systems Theory third period, the same class where Grace had first sat down next to me weeks earlier. The room was a wide amphitheater-style space, curved rows of seats, facing a stage where the instructor, a tall, thin being named Professor Halvorn, lectured on propulsion mathematics that half the class struggled to follow on a good day. Threk sat 2 rows behind us, close enough that I always felt his presence like a low hum of static at the back of my neck, even when he was not doing anything at all. That day, Professor Halvorn had announced a surprise evaluation, a short technical quiz meant to test whether students had actually been keeping up with the material or simply coasting through the semester. Threk had been coasting for weeks, and everyone in the room who had paid attention to the past month knew exactly what that meant for him. The quiz results came back almost immediately, displayed automatically on each student's personal screen the moment they submitted their answers. Professor Halvorn, without thinking much of it, read a handful of scores aloud as examples, the way he sometimes did to encourage stronger students and gently push weaker ones. He read Grace's score first, near perfect, and then, a moment later, read Threk's score, considerably lower, low enough that a ripple of quiet laughter moved through part of the room before anyone could stop it. I saw Threk's face change in an instant. Whatever control he usually kept, even during his worst moments in the hallway, seemed to simply disappear. "You did that," he said, his voice cutting through the room, aimed directly at Grace. It was not loud at first, but there was something underneath it that made every conversation nearby stop immediately. Grace turned slightly in her seat. "Did what?" "You told Marcus to speak up. You've been making me look weak in front of everyone for weeks. Now this." His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath at once. "I didn't write your answers for you," Grace said, her voice steady, unraised. "I also didn't fail to study for you. Those were both choices you made, not things I did to you." Professor Halvorn, standing at the front of the room, seemed to realize for the first time that something serious was happening. "Mr. Vantor," he said, an edge of warning in his voice, "sit down." Threk did not sit down. He stepped out into the aisle instead, his breathing sharp and uneven, humiliation and anger tangled together into something that looked, to every one of us watching, like it had stopped being about grades entirely. "Everyone thinks you're something special," he said, still looking at Grace, ignoring the professor completely now. "The quiet Deathworld girl who doesn't flinch at anything. You've made me a joke in front of this entire class, and I am done being laughed at." That was when he reached into the inner pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a blade. It was not a school-issued tool. It was long, thin, and clearly ceremonial in design, the kind of object that existed on his homeworld as part of formal honor disputes between rival families. A symbol as much as a weapon, legal there in very specific circumstances, utterly forbidden here. The blade caught the classroom lights as he held it low at his side, not raised yet, but present, undeniable, changing the entire atmosphere of the room in the space of a single breath. Someone gasped. Someone else's chair fell over as they scrambled backward. I felt my own heartbeat slam against my ribs, so hard I could hear it in my ears. Professor Halvorn froze completely at the front of the room, and I understood a moment later why. On Threk's homeworld, a drawn blade, in a formal dispute, created a kind of binding social contract that outsiders were not permitted to interrupt without violating deeply held customs. Halvorn, caught between his duty to protect the students in front of him and generations of ingrained cultural instinct telling him not to interfere in what looked like a formal challenge, simply stood there, paralyzed by two competing truths at once. Nobody else moved either. Fear does that to a room. It freezes people in place, makes the air feel thick, makes every second stretch out longer than it should. Grace stood up. She did it slowly, without urgency, the same unhurried way she had stood up in the training dome weeks earlier when the drone had fallen. There was no fear in the movement. There was something else instead, something that took me a moment to recognize because I had never seen it directed at real danger before. She smiled. It was not a mocking smile. It was not cruel or triumphant either. It was small, quiet, almost private, like she had just remembered something from a long time ago, something that made the sight in front of her feel smaller and less significant than everyone else in the room believed it to be. "You really don't know what a knife is for, do you?" she said. Her voice was calm enough that it somehow cut through the panic in the room more effectively than shouting would have. Threk's grip on the blade tightened, his confusion visible for just a moment before anger covered it back over. "I know exactly what it's for," he said. "It's for making sure people stop laughing." "No," Grace said, taking one slow step down into the aisle, closing some of the distance between them instead of retreating from it, which seemed to unbalance him even further. "A blade like that is for someone who has already run out of other ways to solve a problem. You're not holding a weapon right now. You're holding proof that you don't know what else to do. Stay back," he said, raising it slightly, though his hand was not steady. "I'm not going to hurt you," Grace said, and somehow, impossibly, the words sounded completely sincere, the kind of promise you make to someone you genuinely do not want to see get hurt, rather than a taunt. "But I am going to make sure nobody else in this room gets hurt either. Those two things are both true at the same time. You get to decide how easy or difficult that is." For a long moment, nothing happened. The whole room seemed suspended in that space between one breath and the next, every student frozen in their seats, Professor Halvorn still locked in place at the front, unable to act. Then Threk lunged. It happened fast, faster than I could properly follow, a blur of motion that made several students cry out at once. But Grace was already moving before he finished closing the distance, and what followed was nothing like the chaotic struggle I had braced myself for. It was quick. It was almost quiet. She stepped slightly to the side rather than backward, caught his wrist with one hand at the exact angle needed to redirect the force of his own momentum rather than fight against it, and used his forward motion against him instead of trying to overpower it directly. The blade clattered to the floor almost immediately, spinning once before coming to a stop several feet away, well out of reach of either of them. Threk hit the ground a half-second later, not thrown violently, but guided down in a controlled motion that left him more stunned than hurt, his breath knocked out of him, his pride far more damaged than his body. Grace had one knee lightly braced against his shoulder, not pinning him with force, just enough contact to keep him from immediately getting back up, her other hand resting calmly on her own thigh, completely unhurried, as though the entire exchange had taken no more effort than closing a door. The room was utterly silent. Even the ambient hum of the ventilation system seemed too loud in the aftermath. "We done?" Grace asked quietly, looking down at him. Threk did not answer right away. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his eyes wide, fixed on her face like he was seeing something for the very first time, something that did not match anything he had believed about her, about Earth, about what a Deathworld actually meant, up until that exact moment. "Yes," he finally said, the word barely audible. Grace stepped back immediately, releasing him without hesitation, and turned to pick up the blade from the floor. She did not examine it or hold it dramatically. She simply carried it to Professor Halvorn's desk and set it down carefully, handle first, before stepping back to stand near her own seat again, her expression already returning to the same calm neutrality she wore most days. "You should probably report this properly," she said to the professor, her voice gentle rather than accusing, as though she were reminding him of a minor administrative task, rather than the fact that a weapon had just been drawn in his classroom. For his sake, as much as anyone else's. Professor Halvorn seemed to finally unfreeze at the sound of her voice, blinking rapidly, looking between the blade on his desk and the students around the room, several of whom were still gripping their own desks tightly, adrenaline clearly still moving through them. "Everyone," he said, his voice unsteady, "please remain seated. I need to contact security." Nobody argued. Nobody spoke at all, really, for a long stretch of time afterward, the entire room simply absorbing what had just happened, replaying it silently behind wide, stunned eyes. I looked over at Grace, who had already sat back down in her seat, opening her data slate again as though preparing to return to the lecture that had been interrupted, her hands completely steady, no trace of adrenaline visible anywhere in her posture. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly, my own voice barely working properly. She glanced at me, and something in her expression softened slightly, the first real crack I had seen in her composure since she had stood up from her seat minutes earlier. "I'm okay," she said. "It's over now. That's the part that matters." I wanted to ask a dozen questions at once. How she had moved so fast. How she had known exactly which angle to catch his wrist at. How she could smile at a drawn blade the way most people smile at a mildly amusing joke. But the room around us was still too raw, too full of shaken silence, for any of that to feel like the right moment. Security arrived a few minutes later, along with a pair of administrators who looked deeply uncomfortable at having to deal with a situation involving Threk's family. They escorted him out quietly, his earlier fury completely gone, replaced by something quieter and far more unsettled, the look of someone who had learned, in the space of a single unforgettable moment, that everything he thought he understood about strength and weakness had just been proven wrong, in front of an audience he could never take that lesson back from. The rest of the class period was cancelled. Students filed out slowly, in small clusters, talking in hushed voices about what they had just witnessed, glancing back toward Grace, with expressions that had shifted, almost overnight, from casual curiosity into something closer to genuine awe. I stayed behind for a moment as the room emptied, watching Grace gather her things with the same unhurried calm she had carried into the entire confrontation. "You really weren't scared," I said, not quite a question. "I was aware," she said, correcting me gently. "That's different from scared. Fear stops people from thinking clearly. Awareness helps you think faster." She slung her bag over one shoulder and looked toward the door, where the last few students were still filing out, whispering to each other. "Where I grew up, you learn the difference early. Otherwise, you don't grow up at all." I did not fully understand the weight behind that sentence yet, not completely. But standing there in that empty, still unsettled classroom, I understood, for the first time, exactly why people back on Earth called what she came from a Deathworld, and exactly why that word had never once meant weak. News of what had happened in that classroom spread through Cassandra Academy faster than anything I had ever seen move through the school before. By the time evening classes ended, students who had not even been present that morning were already describing the moment in vivid detail, some versions wildly exaggerated, others surprisingly close to what had actually occurred. What stayed consistent in every telling, though, was the same central image. A girl from Earth had stood calmly in front of a drawn blade, smiled, and ended the entire confrontation without raising her voice once. I found myself answering questions for most of the afternoon. Students I barely knew stopping me in hallways to ask if it was true, if she had really moved that fast, if she had really smiled the way people were saying. I told them what I had seen, honestly, without adding anything to it, because the truth alone was already more than enough to leave people speechless. Grace, for her part, seemed almost uncomfortable with the sudden attention. She had never wanted to be the center of anything, and now she could not walk from one class to another without groups of students falling quiet as she passed, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and something close to respect that had not existed a single day earlier. That evening, I found her sitting alone in the study garden behind the east wing, the same spot where we had talked weeks before about Earth and its storms. She was staring out at the artificial sky the school projected above the garden at night, a calm imitation of stars that never quite matched any real constellation. "Everyone keeps asking me the same thing," she said, without looking over, as I sat down beside her. "What's that?" How I wasn't afraid. She let out a breath, quiet and slow. "I keep trying to explain it, and I don't think it's landing the way I want it to." "Try me," I said. She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup of tea slowly between her hands, the steam curling up into the cool evening air. "Where I grew up," she said finally, "you learn very early that fear and danger are not the same experience. A lot of places in the Alliance, people feel fear whenever something dangerous happens, because danger is rare enough that their bodies never really adjust to it. On Earth, if you panicked every single time something dangerous appeared, you would never get anything done. You'd spend your whole life frozen. So instead, people learn to set the fear aside and just deal with the situation directly. It doesn't mean we don't feel it. It just means we don't let it drive." "But a knife," I said, "that's different from a storm or an animal. That's a person trying to hurt you specifically." "It's still just a threat," she said. "My mind doesn't really separate those categories the way you might expect. A threat is a threat. You assess it, you figure out the fastest way to make it stop being a threat, and then you act. The emotional part comes afterward, usually, once it's already over." She looked over at me then, something in her expression more open than I had seen before. "Honestly, tonight, hours later, sitting here, that's actually when it hit me a little, not during, after." "You didn't want to hurt him," I said. It was not really a question, more an observation I had been turning over in my mind since that morning. "No," she said, "I never wanted that. I wanted him to stop, and I wanted everyone else in that room to be safe. Those were the only two things that mattered in that moment. Hurting him wouldn't have made either of those things more true. It would have just made things worse for everyone, including him." She paused. "Where I'm from, people sometimes confuse strength with cruelty. They're not the same thing at all. Real strength usually looks a lot quieter than people expect, and it usually ends things without needing to destroy anything to do it." I thought about the boy from earlier that year who had tested her with a loud clap behind her head, expecting her to jump the way anyone else would. I thought about the professor who had shown that storm footage, expecting gasps, and gotten a calm technical question instead. I thought about Threk himself, flexing his claws in the hallway, expecting fear, and receiving only patient observation. Every single time, people had approached Grace, expecting a particular reaction based on assumptions about what a person, especially a human, especially a girl, was supposed to do when confronted with something frightening. And every single time, she had simply responded with whatever the situation actually required. Nothing more, nothing less. "Can I ask you something else?" I said. "About Earth, about what it was actually like growing up there." She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It's not one thing," she said. "That's what people here always get wrong. They think Deathworld means everyone lives in constant danger, every single day, running from monsters and disasters non-stop. It's not like that. Most days are perfectly ordinary. You go to school, you have meals with your family, you argue with your siblings about something small and forgettable. But underneath all of that ordinary life, there's an awareness that things can change fast, and you have to be ready for that, without it consuming your entire existence. You learn resilience the way you learn language, just by being surrounded by it long enough that it becomes part of how you think, without ever really noticing the moment it happened. That sounds exhausting, I said honestly. It sounds that way from the outside, she said. From the inside, it's just what normal feels like. I didn't realize how differently other people experience danger until I left Earth and started meeting students from calmer worlds. It surprised me at first how much fear controlled people's decisions here. Not because they're weaker, just because they've never needed the same kind of readiness. Their bodies never had a reason to build it. So it's not that humans are stronger, I said, slowly working through the idea out loud. It's that you're built differently, not physically stronger necessarily, just more used to enduring. Grace nodded slowly, and for the first time that evening, something like genuine warmth crossed her expression, like she was glad someone had actually understood the point, instead of just marveling at the surface of what had happened. Exactly that, she said. Adaptability, mostly, and a refusal to treat every hard moment like the end of everything. Earth throws so much at people that if you let each hard thing feel like a catastrophe, you'd break within a year. So instead, you learn to treat difficulty as something to work through, not something to be destroyed by. That mindset just carries over into everything else, even situations that have nothing to do with storms or wildlife, even a boy pulling a blade in a classroom. We sat quietly together for a while after that, the false stars glowing steadily overhead, neither of us needing to fill the silence with more words. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned rather than awkward, the kind that comes after two people have actually understood each other a little better than they did before. Eventually, Grace spoke again, quieter this time, almost to herself. "I don't want people to be afraid of me now," she said. "That's not what I want out of any of this." "I don't think that's what's happening," I said. "I think people are starting to respect you. That's different from fear." "Maybe," she said, though she did not sound entirely convinced. "You didn't hurt him," I said. "You could have. Everyone in that room understood that you could have done a lot worse, and chose not to. That matters. People noticed that part too, even if they're talking more about the fast part." She considered that for a long moment, turning her cup slowly again, watching the last traces of steam disappear into the night air. "I hope so," she said finally, "because that's the part that actually matters to me. Not that I ended it fast, that I ended it without making it worse." We stayed out in the garden a while longer that night, long after most of the school had gone quiet for the evening, and for the first time since she had arrived at Cassandra, I felt like I was not just watching Grace Sutton from a careful distance, admiring or fearing the things she could do. I felt like I was actually starting to understand who she was underneath all of it, and why the word Deathworld, which had always sounded like a warning to the rest of us, had never once made her feel like anything other than exactly where she was supposed to come from. Neither of us knew yet just how much that single classroom moment was about to change, not just for her, but for how every student at Cassandra Academy would think about humans from that point forward. By the following week, the entire academy had settled into a new understanding, one that nobody said out loud in any official way, but that everyone seemed to carry with them regardless. Students who had once treated human classmates with a kind of gentle, dismissive pity now approached them with a quiet, careful curiosity instead. It was not fear exactly, it was something closer to recalibration, the sensation of realizing an old assumption had simply been wrong the entire time. The administration handled the aftermath the way large institutions usually handle things that threaten to embarrass powerful families. There were meetings behind closed doors, quiet conversations between Threk's parents and the school board, careful language used in official reports that avoided the word weapon whenever possible. But the security footage from that classroom existed, clear and undeniable, and it showed exactly what had happened, in exactly the order it had happened. Grace had not attacked anyone. She had defended a room full of frightened students from someone who had already crossed a line no student was permitted to cross, and she had done it while causing the least possible harm to the person responsible. Threk was removed from the academy within the week, transferred quietly to a different institution closer to his homeworld, one better suited, according to the official explanation, to his particular needs. Nobody believed that explanation entirely, but nobody argued with it either. Whatever had happened to him internally in that classroom, whatever certainty about his own dominance, had been shattered the moment Grace caught his wrist and guided him to the floor without effort. It seemed to have changed something in him that the school itself no longer felt equipped to manage. I never saw him again after that week, though I heard, much later, second-hand through students who kept in loose contact with him, that he had become noticeably quieter at his new school, less inclined toward the kind of casual intimidation that had defined him at Cassandra. I do not know if that was true. I choose to believe it was, mostly because it fits better with the story Grace always insisted on believing herself, the idea that even the worst confrontations could end with something other than lasting damage, if you were careful enough about how you ended them. For Grace, life at the academy changed in smaller, quieter ways. Teachers who had barely acknowledged her presence before now called on her more often in class, genuinely curious about her perspective rather than simply filling time. Students who had never spoken to her directly began sitting near her at lunch, asking careful, respectful questions about Earth, about her life there, about what it had actually been like growing up, somewhere so different from the comfortable, controlled worlds most of them called home. She answered those questions patiently, the same way she had answered mine in the study garden that first night after everything happened. She never made Earth sound like a boast or a badge of superiority. She talked about it the way you might talk about any difficult place you loved anyway, honestly, without exaggeration, careful to mention both the genuine hardships and the ordinary forgettable happiness that had existed alongside them the whole time. One afternoon, a few weeks after the incident, a younger student, one of the ones who had been in that laboratory session with Marcus weeks earlier, approached Grace during a free period with a question that seemed to have been building in him for a while. "Were you scared?" he asked. During the class, when he pulled it out, Grace thought about the question for a moment before answering, the same careful consideration she gave everything. "A little," she admitted. "Not the kind of scared that makes you freeze, though, the kind that makes you pay closer attention." "How did you know exactly what to do?" "I didn't plan it in advance," she said. "There wasn't time to plan anything. My body just already knew, because it had practiced knowing for a long time before that day. That's really the whole secret, if there is one. It's not about being fearless. It's about being ready long before the moment actually needs you to be." The boy nodded slowly, clearly turning the idea over in his mind, the kind of quiet thoughtfulness that suggested the answer would stay with him longer than most things he heard in an ordinary conversation. I watched these small moments accumulate over the following weeks, one after another, small shifts in how people at Cassandra Academy thought about humans, about Earth, about the word Deathworld itself. It had always carried a certain tone before, spoken with a kind of distant, almost amused pity, the way you might describe an unfortunate accident of geography. After that classroom, the word started to carry a different weight entirely. Less pity, more quiet respect. The kind reserved for something that had been consistently, deeply underestimated for far too long. Grace and I stayed close friends for the rest of that year, and in the quieter conversations we had afterward, she opened up more than she ever had that first week, sharing small pieces of her life on Earth, the way you slowly reveal a photograph, one corner at a time. She told me about storms that could level entire towns and the neighbors who rebuilt anyway, every single time, without ever seriously considering leaving. She told me about creatures on Earth that could end a human life in seconds, and the quiet, practical respect people held for them anyway, understanding that danger and beauty often lived in exactly the same place. She told me that humans had spent so much of their history simply learning how to keep going that eventually going stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like an identity. None of it sounded like boasting when she said it. It sounded like someone describing home, plainly and honestly, the good parts and the hard parts intertwined so completely that separating them would have meant telling a lie. Near the end of that year, during a quiet evening in the same study garden where so many of our conversations had happened, I asked her one final question that had been sitting with me since that morning in the classroom, one I had never quite found the right moment to ask. "Why did you smile?" I said. "Right before you stopped him. Everyone talks about that part almost as much as what happened after. You looked at a drawn blade and smiled like it was nothing." Grace considered the question for a long time, longer than she usually took, looking out at the artificial stars glowing steadily above us. "You don't smile at something like that because you're not scared," she said finally, her voice quiet but certain. "You smile because somewhere underneath the fear, you already know exactly how it's going to end. That knowing is the calm part. The smile is just what it looks like from the outside." I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, turning it over the way she had taught me to turn over difficult ideas instead of reacting to them immediately. It explained so much about her, about Earth, about the strange, quiet confidence that had confused an entire school full of students from far gentler worlds. The galaxy had spent generations calling Earth a Deathworld, treating the label as a kind of quiet joke, evidence of a planet too harsh to be taken seriously, a place whose people deserved sympathy rather than respect. Standing in that garden, months after watching Grace disarm a boy twice her size without raising her voice once, I finally understood how wrong that assumption had always been. A Deathworld was never a place that produced weakness. It was a place that had spent centuries quietly producing something the rest of the galaxy had simply forgotten how to recognize. Not the loudest strength, not the most obvious strength, just the kind that stayed calm exactly when it needed to, the kind that ended things without needing to destroy anything to do it, the kind that smiled at a blade because it had already decided, long before that moment ever arrived, exactly how the story was going to end. And once you had seen that kind of strength up close, really seen it, you never mistook it for weakness again.